that we have some experienced generals and ambassadors with us, because what we'll be seeking to do during today's lecture is to understand how we got here, and also to try and make notes on how we can get out of this hole, to avoid all this humanitarian suffering and all these internal displacements and the catastrophes which we've been watching on our TV stations. The difficulty we've all had is that we've not really got a grasp of it. We want to understand the issues. What are the real issues? Is this just a pure power struggle? Is this a failure of political transitions? Is this an addiction in Sudan to coup d'etats? What are the implications for the region? The neighbors like Chad, Ethiopia? What are the implications for international community? Russia and its Wagner, the US, the UK, Egypt, Libya. But most important of all, what is the way forward? We're particularly honored to have with our guest speaker today, a professor who knows the subject thoroughly. I now have the pleasure to ask Ambassador Cabral Bliami here, who's the Vice President of the Council, to introduce Professor Tim MURITHI. Cabral, you have the floor.
Thanks, Mr. President. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today. In this age of social media, a simple touch on your smartphone would tell you a lot about him. To reveal that he's a professor, he's the head of the Peace Building Interventions Program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town. That he has about 29 years experience in the fields of peace building, security, international justice, governance, and development. And he's a published author and editor, and that you can find out in any of your searches. But I want to depart from what Google will reveal and say that when he was recommended in our search for a distinguished guest speaker for this event, he was highly recommended. And I had to then make the first contact. And what impressed me was his readiness as an African patriot to be part of the search for a solution to the crisis in Sudan and other places in Africa, which has been his passion and engagement over the last 3 decades. And then I decided to look out for friends who might know him, because I cannot, we just had a few chat on WhatsApp, and then we had a telephone conversation, and that convinced me that he was the right person for the occasion. Then I talked to Ghana's ambassador to Mali in the person of His Excellency Napoleon Abdullahi. And I asked Napoleon that, what should I say about our guest speaker, Professor Tim? And he said that, just say this about him. He's a long-standing professor in conflict studies. He's one of the few and original and earlier African academics that took conflict prevention, management, and resolution seriously. So I'm convinced that he's qualified to speak to the crisis in Sudan as an Africanist, as a Pan-Africanist, and as a concerned citizen of the world. So this is what I'll say about our distinguished guest speaker for today, Professor Tim MURITHI.
Prof, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Chair. I just would like to start by thanking the the Ghana Council on Foreign Relations, for this invitation, and also for that very generous introduction. In particular, let me just thank Ambassador Cabral, who I was interacting with in Accra, and also Ambassador William in Addis Ababa, who in fact made the recommendation. And I would also like to recognize Ambassador Chambers, who we've been working with. He's the High Representative of the African Union for silencing the guns. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share some thoughts and ideas with you. We are faced with a very catastrophic situation in Sudan right now. And let us keep the innocent people, the women and the children in our hearts at this very difficult time for them as they face this unspeakable war of destruction. And also, as we do that, let's also focus on what we can do as Africans, as Pan-Africanists, as people who are concerned to assist in enabling the country to emerge from the quagmire that it finds itself. So I'm very honored to be here to share my perspective on Sudan with you. My background, as mentioned, is almost 3 decades in peace building at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation based in Cape Town. And we have provided technical support to peace building to colleagues both in Sudan and South Sudan, with insights drawn from across our beloved continent. I have traveled to South Sudan in 2011, where I had the opportunity to engage with government officials, civil society, actors to support and their efforts to consolidate peace after a very lengthy, brutal war. And we are currently working with a group of Sudanese civil society actors, helping them build capacity to address transitional justice and peace building, issues in their country. And I'll be traveling to Nairobi, in fact, next week, to be with our Sudanese colleagues, who some of them have managed to come out of the country for this sorts of interventions. And we're obviously drawing insights from our very own African Union transitional justice policy, adopted in February 2019 by the AU heads of state and government in Addis Ababa. So I've titled my talk, Sudan, a Revolution Betrayed. And I'm looking specifically at the challenge of the failure to implement transitional justice in Sudan as the catalyst for the crisis that we're currently facing. I don't know if you can see the screen properly. I hope you can. I'm trying to make sure I've shared it okay. Can you see the screen? Can I get a thumbs up? You can see the screen. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so in terms of what I'm going to focus on, I'm going to look at a little bit of the background and the context to the current situation, to the situation in Sudan, and also to the country itself, the history, the geography, the politics of Sudan, the legacy of the regimes in Sudan, and also the very debilitating North-South conflict that took place in that country, very long and brutal, and also the Darfur conflict, which I think we'll remember from 2003 onwards, and then fast forward to the 2019 revolution and the adoption of the Sudan Constitutional Charter, the 2021 coup d'etat, and then touch upon the issue of how this revolution was betrayed by the failure to implement transitional justice. Then look at some AU IGAD interventions, the Juba-led initiative of April last month, and the ongoing Saudi Arabia-US Jeddah initiative on establishing humanitarian corridors for those who are trying to escape from the country. So I think we're all familiar with what happened on the 15th of April. Very deadly fighting broke out in Khartoum between the Sudan Armed Forces, SAF, headed by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the de facto ruler of Sudan, and the Rapid Support Forces, which were previously paramilitary forces, actually emerged from the Janjaweed involved in Darfur. And we'll talk about that, led by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemeti, who was the deputy to Burhan. And the fighting has now expanded to many parts of Sudan. West Darfur, we hear almost 200,000 refugees are flowing across the border. 6,000 people have been killed in the country. 900,000 have been displaced. And so it's turning into a very catastrophic situation. You can see some of the images of the attacks and the destruction in the city of Khartoum and in the neighboring parts of the country. So how did we get to this point? I think is the question that we want to ask ourselves. This is a very long-standing, the crisis has deep historical roots in terms of tension between the key players that are now fighting. It does include a dimension of contest to capture the state power. It also includes a dimension of the failure to transform and reform the security sector. This is the dimension of transitional justice that we will touch upon. And ultimately, it's also a story of the betrayal of a people-led revolution. The Sudanese people fought very hard in the streets, a lot of them suffering, arrested, tortured, beaten, and imprisoned just to get to a situation where we could have a transition to democracy. It's also a story of the regionalization and the internationalization of the conflict. If we talk about Sudan, we have to do a retrospective and look at, the nature of the history of this country. It's a very, very complex history, as I would say, and we obviously wouldn't have enough time to go into depth, but we're looking far back in time, where the Egyptian civilization straddled parts of what we call Sudan today, ancient Kemet, and the Nubian empires, the kingdom of the Kush, which were actually, they were, people with brown skin, so to speak. Then a history of Arabization and Islamicization from the 15th to the 19th century. And that actually leads it feeds into some of what we are seeing playing out. From the 15th century, the Sultanate of the Funj in the east of the country, and the Sultanate of the Dar Afur in the west, which is today what we call Darfur, from 1650 onwards. And then we fast forward to 1820, when there was a Turkish-Egyptian, almost a joint condominium colonization of this area called Sudan, what we call the Turkiya. And then this also fed into the multiple heritages that we see spread across Sudan, both in the north and also in the south and other parts of the country. An African Arab Islamicized Sudanese identity, which is not clear-cut. You can't say those are the Arabs and these are the Africans. It's much more complex than that, very complex identity formation. There are some people with dark skin who actually identify themselves as Arab, some with light skin who might not do so. So it's actually very, very complex history. And in 1899, the British entered the scene, British colonialism. It's actually a British-Egyptian condominium, but Britain was very much in control on this project of asserting colonial authority across this very vast land of Sudan. There you can see images of some of the British colonialists who were involved in brutally suppressing the people of Sudan. And the image above is the ancient pyramids that were in some of the earlier empires that inhabited this very culturally rich land. And then we move to transitioning on forwards, the identities that emerged, particularly towards and the independence of the country. Was very interesting. There's a northern elite, very much Arabized, I would say, Islamicized, who have this phrase called Aulad al-Balad, children of the land. the self-ascribed identity of the northern elites who believe also in the divine right to rule. So General Al-Burhan would be in this category. The long history of Sudan's links to Egypt, or at least the northern elites' links to Egypt, emerge from this history and from this heritage. This is contrasted with the militant resistance historically from the south, the east, and the west of Sudan, which the northerners had denigrated as Dar Fertit, land of the enslavable communities. And you will find that, in fact, General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo Hemeti, in fact, comes from one of the ethnic groups in Darfur that fits into this category, even though he was involved in the conflict, and we will talk about that later on. So what we find is that we have this group, this self-identifying group that sees itself as having the right to have hegemony over Sudan, and another group that seeks to participate and benefit from the land as equals. And this is the tension that's actually been playing out in a lot of the conflicts, the North-South conflict, the Darfur conflict, and it's also now, in fact, been imported by Hemeti's approach into Khartoum to try, in fact, take over power. So you have hegemonic power brokers in the center, Khartoum, and the militant resistance in the periphery. I think this is what we are seeing being played out in the battle for Khartoum. It's a very complex matrix of dominion and resistance that goes back in time. If we just quickly track the post-independence period in Sudan, 1956, independence, 55, 56, post-independence Sudan, 55 to 72, there was the first civil war. And in 69, a coup d'etat, Jafar Numeri takes over. In 72, Addis Ababa agreement between the North and South, this long-standing first civil war, comes to a temporary end. And in 83, it flares up again. And we see the emergence of the Sudanese People's Liberation Army. And then fast forward to 89, when there's a coup d'etat, Omar al-Bashir, who we know is also still currently in arrest, but at the military hospital, we believe, in Sudan, who governed for quite a long time before the revolution took place. And some of the historical context, and to give you a little bit of background to this gentleman called Hemeti. I don't know if we can call him a gentleman, but there we are. 25th of April, 2003, the Sudan Liberation Army, Justice and Equality Movement, an armed militia involved in attacking the Sudanese army and air force in Darfur. They were obviously fighting for their rights to participate. And this is when the Janjaweed paramilitary was activated by Omar al-Bashir. The Janjaweed, colloquial term to actually stand for devils on a horseback or something close to that. And that's what they used to do, actually rode around in horses, and the scorched earth policy, very brutal, burning, mutilating, killing, torture, rape, which was in fact subsequently categorized as genocide by the International Criminal Court, which created the tension that led to Omar al-Bashir's indictment and arrest warrants. 2005, African Union deployed, in fact, its first mission, African Union mission in Sudan, and had many, many challenges, troops of about 3,000. Eventually it grew, but the challenges were quite insurmountable for the AU, and eventually it handed over to the United Nations and UN AU hybrid mission, UNAMID, from 2009, that lasted about 13 years. And then in 2011, 9th of July, we see South Sudan independence with much fanfare, a new beginning for the South. And shortly after that, things began to shift in the North. 2013, Janjaweed is rebranded, in fact, is rebranded into the Rapid Support Forces by al-Bashir. And al-Bashir is doing this deliberately. This is a force that he believes can be almost a counterweight to the army and the rest of the military force, right? And then General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo Hemeti as is also known, is appointed as the head of the Rapid Support Forces. And Hemeti had always been involved in the Janjaweed interventions in Darfur. He rose up through the ranks, but this was when he literally became the head of this RSF, which Bashir subsequently gave, a legitimacy and turned into a fighting force within the military structure of Sudan. Hemeti is known for having quite a broad range of nefarious trade links. He started some trade dealing in Darfur. Unfortunately, has also been implicated in human trafficking and sending mercenaries to fight in Saudi Arabia with Saudi Arabia against the Yemen. And so he has a very checkered background. But also to say that General Burhan was also involved in the Darfur conflict as a military commander. So, we don't have angels on this particular kind of story. We have, quite a number of checkered individuals, let me put it that way. In 2021, UNAMID is transitioning to UNITAM, which is still in the country. It's a political mission rather than a peacekeeping mission. And unfortunately, that is all that we have at the moment in Sudan. So that's why the interventions are quite constrained or limited. Then we move to the more recent history, 2019 revolution and the primacy of the people rise. And there you see that symbolic, almost iconic image of this woman who stood mobilizing the Sudanese peoples. And I must say, one of the formations that was quite active is the Sudan Professionals Association, SPA, which led nationwide sit-ins. There were also resistant committees which were involved in organizing people as they were uprising in the country. And ultimately, this led on the 11th of April to the military itself, the military ousting al-Bashir and establishing a transitional military council, a TMC. And the civil society groups, the social movement actors, the unions, they all came together under the umbrella of the Forces for Freedom and Change. So which is an umbrella political formation of 150 organizations. And in fact, it became a partner in the new political dispensation in Sudan. It was one of the pillars of the groups that came together to establish the Sudanese constitutional charter, which we'll discuss later on. African Union and Ethiopia at that stage were involved in brokering talks between the Transitional Military Council and the Forces for Freedom and Change. And on the 5th of July, 2019, there was a political declaration or agreement between these actors to actually come together and co-govern the country. And there you can see them standing, opposite each other in mixed groups. Good to see there was also gender representation. And this group worked diligently to, in fact, adopt a constitutional charter by 4th August 2019. And the constitutional charter depicted that 39 months from the signing of this document, there would be a transition towards a civilian led government. And there were transitional justice provisions within this document. So this formation was called the Sovereignty Council, and it always existed with a very fragile balance of power. And in this constitutional charter, chapter 4, you see how the Sovereignty Council will be constituted. The Sudan Army and the Rapid Support Forces, so Burhan and Hemeti, would have 5 representatives each. The Forces for Freedom and Change would have 5 representatives each, and 1 civilian would be appointed jointly, almost to play that role of prime minister of the state. And chapter 15 of the Constitutional Charter, Article 67, actually states that there was an urgency to start implementing transitional justice and accountability measures like right away, right? And I think that is where there was some change. There were efforts to adopt a transitional justice bill, but that was ultimately, squandered and ultimately marginalized. In March 2020, a very dramatic assassination attempt on Prime Minister Hamdok, who was ultimately appointed as the Prime Minister of the Sovereignty Council. Hamdok, with a background in United Nations, an economist, formerly deputy head of the United Nations Economic Commission in Addis Ababa. Very calm and very deliberate, very focused, highly intelligent gentleman, and I think he took this position under duress. I think he was very much a reluctant prime minister, but he did it for the sake of his country, which he wanted to assist in supporting. Tensions continue to build up. I think factionalism within the Forces for Freedom and Change, the politicking between the different factions within the civilian grouping, was not well received by the generals. The generals themselves, military men are not necessarily experts at dialogue. They know how to issue orders and also how to receive orders. But this civilians are always involved in very lengthy conversations and dialogues. And I think the factionalism put the generals off quite significantly. And on the 25th of October, 2021, there was a coup d'etat. Actually, General Al Burhan oversaw this coup d'etat. Ahmedi was also involved. So actually, both of them were involved in deposing the civilian component of the Sovereignty Council. The Prime Minister was arrested and put under house arrest. Ultimately, he managed to go back with his family to his home. And on November 21, 2021, Hamdok came to a political agreement with the military forces, but that agreement actually marginalized some of the civilian formations in the Forces for Freedom and Change, and there you begin to see some of the betrayal of the revolution beginning. In fact, the hard work that the people had done on the streets. At that stage, there was 40 people killed, 200 people injured in uprisings that were taking place. But the factionalism had undermined efforts to govern so much that Hamdok, in fact, established a technocratic government, and the Freedom for Forces and Change were marginalized. We fast forward to 2nd of January 2022, when Hamdok himself also says that he's had enough. In his speech, he's actually very emphatic in saying that both the civilians and the military in the attempted shared power government were actually undermining future efforts to build an inclusive, an accommodative Sudan for all. And that's one of the reasons why he gave for resigning. And so here we find ourselves with a situation where we have two armies, the Rapid Support Forces and the army, the main army of Sudan under Burhan, both with almost equal might. I think the army, 100,000 troops, Rapid Support Forces, not far off, 110, perhaps 1,000 troops as well. And tension really over security sector reform and amalgamation of the Rapid Support Forces into the army, into the main military structure of Sudan. This is really this is the crux of the matter here. And the issue was the duration of the integration of the two armies. Al Burhan, who was obviously nominally the leader of the country and has been the leader for quite some time as the chair of the Sovereignty Council since he took over from Hamdok in the coup d'etat, Al Burhan wanted 2 years and to amalgamate the RSF into the military. Ahmedi argued for 10 years because not only is he the head of this RSF, but he's also benefiting privately through. Remember, we talked about the gold trade, some of the mercenary work that they're doing. They actually make money from that. It's actually a source of income, and that's why you find the RSF is in fact quite well stocked with resources, with equipment, with weapons, uniform, and ground. One thing they don't have are the planes, in fact, and this is why you see the way the 15th of April conflict broke out. Al Burhan's forces are very much relying on using, fighter jets to bomb RSF positions in Khartoum. And RSF is attacking the military bases, armed bases, to actually try to subjugate the army and take over power. And I must say, RSF believes that they are on the upward trajectory, and we'll talk about why it's making it very difficult to actually have a peacemaking process and an agreement where, in fact, the two sides can meet. Both sides believe that they can actually prevail in this conflict, which is an absolute catastrophic situation for the country. When the two elephants fight, it is the little mouse in the middle who will in fact get trampled on. So this is where we are in terms of what's happening now in the country. And in fact, many people argue that including the military, in a power sharing situation is a very, very challenging thing to try to attempt. Just based on past experience, right? So many felt that this would actually not lead to a handover of power to civilians, and there were arguments on both sides. They said, well, you also have to bring them along in the journey, and I think one of the issues is that when we look at the situation from a transitional justice perspective, so 2019 Sudan Constitutional Charter itself has a specific article on transitional justice, chapter 15, article 670-67, which was not implemented. In fact, it was quarantined and almost pushed to the side during this transition period. Our very own African Union has a transitional justice policy, which has very specific recommendations on security sector reform, but it really talks about how peace agreements should lead into wider national dialogue processes, truth recovery processes for the victims and the survivors, memorialization of what's happened in the past so people don't forget, psychosocial support and healing for those who have suffered. And it also talks about Section 4 of the AUTJP, talks about the importance of the AU and the regional actors, IGAD, Intergovernmental Authority on Development in the Horn of Africa, to address transboundary and conflicts. In West Africa, obviously, you have your ECOWAS, which plays a similar role, and transitional justice becomes a very important dimension in trying to, first of all, address the atrocities that have been endured by the victims, the survivors and their families, but also it operationalizes education programs, societal awareness raising, and puts onto the 4 issues that need to be addressed. So Sudan, like other African countries that have endured violations from the past, in fact, need to prioritize this, and rather than seeing it as as a nice to have, which you can postpone for later on. In fact, that should have been one of the first things that were really implemented at the outset. And security sector reform is also mentioned in the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, and this is really at the heart of what's happening in Sudan right now: the failure to implement security sector reform, failure to reform the judiciary, and the failure to implement these provisions, coupled with the fragmentation and the politicization of the shared government. We begin to see now a democratic reversal, a retrogressive authoritarianism, and we hope it's not going to end up going back to a dictatorship, but that is yet to unfold. So that's the situation within the country. I think we also need to look at the regionalization of this conflict. There are obviously 7 countries neighboring Sudan, and there have been historical tensions between Sudan and Chad linked to the Darfur crisis 2003 onwards. There are tensions between Sudan and Ethiopia linked to the Nile River, resources from the Nile River, and tension around that, and that also includes Egypt. So Egypt has an interest in the outcome of this. We're already seeing refugee flows from West Darfur into Chad, and then also the internationalization of this conflict. And we're seeing Sudan and Russia recently signing an agreement for the port of Sudan to host a Russian military base with 300 troops, 4 ships, including nuclear-capable ships. And that port of Sudan, you can see where it is, you can see where Jeddah is, and Eritrea in the south there. And obviously you've heard of the Russia's Wagner group, and obviously there are other mercenary groups there operating in Sudan. Wagner are known to be aligned with the rapid support forces of Hamdi, US, therefore, is pushing back. This is a big now geopolitical game, feeding into the Russia-Ukraine conflict. US pushing back on this Russian attempt to create a sphere of influence through the United Arab Emirates and the Saudis through the initiative. United Arab Emirates are building at the port of Sudan a port worth $6 billion. So they obviously do not want to see their investment go up in smoke, and that's why they're pushing quite hard behind the scenes. And I think that's why you see the Jeddah initiative emerging more recently as last week, and we will talk about that very briefly as we begin to conclude. So this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a war of generals, two armies facing off each other, Al-Burhan and Hemeti. You can see the air power there that Burhan still has. African Union interventions. There was an initial ministerial meeting convened by Moussa Faki, chair of the AU Commission, on the 20th of April. It was done online. It was a Zoom meeting. And then eventually, IGAD has designated the lead mediator, Salva Kiir, president of South Sudan. And that is actually quite ironic that the South Sudanese now are trying to play a role to help bring together the forces of the North that were involved for a very long time, almost several decades, actually subjugating them and in fact, oppressing them. But Kiir issued a statement on the 10th of May, about 8 days ago, stating that he's the designated lead mediator for IGAD, and he's going to drive this process forward. The African Union Peace and Security Council issued a communique early on the 16th of April, is currently monitoring the situation as well, has also created an enhanced grouping of actors to actually try to assist with this process going forward. 6th of May, we see the Saudi Arabia-US parallel initiative, the Jeddah talks, ostensibly to look for ways to create civilian protection, which is not in fact happening. Even though the talks took place, there was a so-called declaration agreed by both sides, though the fighting continued, unfortunately, quite brutally within Sudan. So the way forward really is for all of us to put our hands, all hands on deck to assist Sudan to pull back from the brink of total fragmentation, to avoid further betraying the revolution of the people and negotiate a transition somehow that has a very strong emphasis now on security sector reform as a priority, and acknowledging that this is a really vast country with very diverse, people and cultures. And the idea is drawing up a social contract, a social, political, economic contract with all sections of the Sudanese society, which will require reconfiguring the state. And I think on this issue, I think the Ghana Council on Foreign Relations, engaging Ghana government, using all possible avenues. Ghana is currently on the UN PSC, so it can monitor the issue quite closely. As I mentioned before, one of your distinguished sons, Ambassador Chambers, is the AU Special Envoy on silencing the guns, and we need the guns to be silenced in Khartoum, where we can assist, where we can find ways to actually assist and ensure we can broker peace to prevent the suffering of our brothers and sisters in this senseless conflict in Sudan. So thank you very much for listening to what I had to say. I really appreciate that, and also for inviting me to share some thoughts with you. Thank you very much.
And it was brilliant. I'm sure that a lot of participants are ready to ask questions. So if you indicate, if you're willing to ask a question, then we can take the questions. But perhaps before I take questions from the floor, I have two questions, Prof. You made a comment about the fact that both sides believe that they can prevail. And in any mediation process, until the two sides determine that they have a stake in a negotiated settlement, the likelihood of a positive outcome is very unlikely. So really, we seem to be, we may not be ready yet for, and I'm afraid that that's the impression I get. And that would be very unfortunate. The second question I have is that I notice what IGAD is doing. I notice what the AU is doing. I notice even the UN and Ghana's is doing some work through the Security Council. Are there too many cooks? And is there sufficient coordination of the mediation efforts? And is there centrality of authority to determine the direction of the mediation process? Prof, those were my two initial questions.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think I completely concur with your assessment that, you know, until the two sides see that there's a likelihood of a pathway for them to, you know, get outcomes that they're pursuing through the mediation process, they're very unlikely to stop the fighting. Unfortunately, that is where we are at the moment, which is, as I said, quite catastrophic for the people of Sudan. But the role of the mediators, the facilitators, the third-party actors is always to persevere in looking and engaging the actors to see if there are potential openings that can actually alleviate or bring the parties to the table and commit them to some serious, you know, dialogue and outcomes that will create a pathway to peacemaking. As you've seen, and in fact, to support your argument, we've seen a number of attempts to create ceasefires so that the people who are affected, you know, people are trapped in their homes, they don't have access to water, water is drying up, access to food, medicines, electricity now is also an issue. There were attempts to stop the fighting so that the people, those who could leave their residential homes. And in fact, people have just been trying to struggle and escape without, in fact, having any form of protection. So those ceasefires have failed. And even the most recent Jeddah initiative, which the US and Saudis have been driving, even though it has been signed, the fighting hasn't stopped. It's still going on as we speak right now. And so very much as you state, yes, this is a huge challenge when the two sides can't see, you know, the benefits of mediating. It becomes a major issue. Now, on the proliferation of third parties, mediators, and so on and so forth, this is a classic challenge that we have on the African continent. There's always a proliferation of envoys and so on. In the Sudan, in the Darfur crisis, there were up to 15 different envoys from different countries and actors, including AU, EU, UN, and then a lot of the European countries, their own special envoys. The Americans had their own envoys and so on and so forth. So 15 different ones. And this means that the lead mediator has to be able to build a web and say, he or she is the focal point, focal mediator. So in this case, it will be President Kiir. And then all of these other special envoys and all these other initiatives are actually supposed to feed into that process to help the different parties come to the table. And secondary actors and so on and so forth, and those working behind the scenes, those might even be some forces that we're not aware of that might be involved, finding those and bringing them to the table. So you're absolutely right. This needs to be coordinated. This needs to be, it needs to be structured in a way that the lead mediator can actually be the one that will convene and all the other actors are actually supporting. Now with the US, Saudi, the Jeddah initiative, we are wondering whether this is the creation of another parallel process, which can create even more confusion, because now if Burhan and Hemeti feel that they can get a better deal in Jeddah, or that the per diem is better in Jeddah, they go to Jeddah, they don't go to Juba, where in fact the IGAD is supposed to lead the process, you know. So this is something I think the African Union has to guard against. The AU Peace and Security Council convened a meeting. Ambassador Bankole of Nigeria was in fact central to that process of in fact creating an enhanced mechanism that actually tries to map out who the different actors with interests are in this particular case, but to ensure that they're working in a coordinated fashion. So there is a document, an African Union document has actually stated that this is actually how this should operate. IGAD is lead mediator, AU is there, AU Commission is there, AU PSC is there, and then all the other actors. In fact, there's been a very strong argument from the African side saying, we don't want this conflict to become, hijacked by international actors who are obviously going to use it for their own, to try to pursue their own interests and their own agenda. This is a conflict that should be addressed by African actors. And we now, as Africans, really have to come to the party. We can't say we want to address this, and then we sit on our hands and actually hope that something is going to happen miraculously. And it's not going to happen miraculously. We have to then act. Let me stop there, and we'll take in a few more comments from the floor.
Mr. Cabral has a question for you.
It's actually not my question. It's a
comment.
No, on my way to this session, a friend who could not access this program asked me to pose this question to you, that how do you assess and rate the response and the role of the AU in the resolution of this crisis? And externally, how do you assess the response of the so-called international community to the crisis in Sudan? Because if you consider other crises like the war in Ukraine, you see the response is different from what we are experiencing in this particular crisis. This is not my question. This is somebody's concern that say I should direct to you.
Prof, before you answer the question, I was just wondering that in fairness, I noticed that the political advisor to Ambassador Bankole, Ambassador William Kanyirige, is online. Perhaps, William, would you want to make a comment about the AU and what the political department is doing before Prof responds? William, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Yes. Please go ahead.
First of all, you've got me. Otherwise, I intended just to listen and update my commissioner appropriately. But since you ask, let me first of all thank Prof for graciously accepting to address the Council of Foreign Relations and its guest, and for the wonderful delivery you've given us. But just to quickly say that, one, there's a lot that is going on. Unfortunately, because of the style of the AU and our African leaders, and of course, in terms of diplomacy, a lot of this is not in the public domain. So our African citizens sometimes get the impression that our leaders and institutions are not doing anything or not doing much. The regional neighbors, if you look at the individual level, like Ethiopia and others, are engaged in a constant manner with the parties in Sudan. To IGAD, the REC concerned is also engaged. And as the team mentioned, we have the President Salva Kiir, who is leading a 3-member presidential team to mediate. We also have the African Union, the Peace and Security Council is involved, and team mentioned, and in response, the part response to your question, the chairperson of the African Union, His Excellency Faki Mahamat, as team mentioned, convened that virtual meeting precisely to respond to the challenge of the different approaches that are ongoing to ensure that it's coordinated and that we are having common messaging moving forward. That is going to be a very difficult, but it's a compelling assignment because of certain vested interest and also long-standing relations going beyond our continent. And as Tim mentioned, you have the Jeddah initiative, and the question is the AU losing leadership? Not really. Some of our partners, as Tim had explained, have certain special interests, and so they share that with us, even though we have ownership. And so they try, to make certain moves. And even though President Kiir is leading the mediation, the Jeddah initiative is supposed to prepare grounds for the Salva Kiir mediation to take off effectively because of the very complex nature of what has been unfolding. As we speak, the chairperson of the African Union is on his way to an extraordinary summit of the Arab League. They participated in the last PSC session on Sudan, and he's going to carry forward the same message that was shared when he convened that virtual meeting with the various actors. There are other mechanisms that are in place coming from the side of our partners. Only this afternoon, my commissioner was meeting with some of them, and there are efforts of all stakeholders, both African and non-African, appreciate that we need to coordinate. But as at now, there's some kind of housekeeping work to be done before the Salva Kiir mediation can effectively take off, and that is what is ongoing. And the African Union is determined to take the leadership of the process. Our information is that the two main stakeholders are not averse to that, and hopefully we will soon be crossing that bridge when the housekeeping is done with the support of our partners. That's the little that I can say for now, and thank you for the opportunity to share.
Oh, William, that's very, very useful. Prof, over to you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think Ambassador William has very, very nicely addressed what the African Union is doing. And I think the challenge is these AU interventions, they're always happening behind the scenes, and rightly so, because you can't be publicizing everything because you will get your Twitter rati, making your life very complicated. So rightly so that the AU should be doing this, through quiet diplomacy and so on. I think the occasional press release, and in fact, that's something that is happening, is useful just to let the people know that in fact there is something that is being done. And I've seen a few of the press releases, both also President Kiir is also releasing information that's saying this is happening and so on and so forth. And so that has been covered very well. So this mechanism called the extended mechanism is in fact trying to corral all the different actors together. And I think it's an important initiative that the African Union is taking. And we are really hopeful that things will move forward. As you said, as the two generals don't see this thing ending anytime soon. The Jeddah initiative has been described as a pre-negotiation. But we know that there are international actors, regional actors who have tremendous interests on the outcome in Sudan. I mentioned UAE and its vast, $6 billion investment in Port of Sudan. Saudi Arabia itself has had security, links with the RSF in the past, and other countries in the region, Ethiopia Egypt. So the international dimension, I don't think is going to go away anytime soon. So there is a minimal threat that the process can be almost waylaid by the extent to which international actors are putting pressure on the parties in this particular crisis. And the danger is that they don't, in fact, hijack the intervention, because it will not necessarily be in the interest of the African continent if this process is hijacked by external forces or external actors who are clearly pursuing their own agenda. But the internationalization of this crisis is almost impossible to prevent. It's happening, and the regionalization of it as well is also happening. And we just we as Africans need to do what we can to support the African Union and IGAD to drive this process forward through all our back channels, our track to diplomacy, to ensure that we in fact maintain the momentum and are also driving the initiative going forward. So let me stop there, Ambassador.
Thank you, Prof. And talking about track 2 diplomacy, thank you for the hint you gave at the end of your speech as to what the Council on Foreign Relations Ghana can do. We've taken the hint and we'll take it forward. We have a question from Joseph Atamensa of the ECA from Addis. Joseph, if you're online, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And thanks to the Council for, again, leading on issues of pertinent to the continent. And so I'm very grateful that I'm invited, and I've enjoyed listening to the Prof. Prof, excellent presentation.
It was very good.
Question I have is, why is it that there's no decision either by my organization, the UN, to impose a no-fly zone? You remember what happened in Libya, right? Because the repercussions of bomb and so it's curious about the question of a no-fly zone to the question. To find that trust is a commodity in by the power as the process, where is the GATT process, because we get challenges, and then it's very rare commodity in that process. This is where probably a neutral party, maybe outside the horn, might be needed to do this, because all those parties involved sort of have an interest in this one way or the other. I mean, Djibouti would prefer that one side doesn't win so that there's no Russian port, because the Russians, they are benefiting from the ports that are, the Americans are there, the Spaniards are there, the Chinese are there, you know. So all this complicates how you solve the problem. And I think the last question I want to ask is, given where we are now in the fight, it seems to me that Hemeti seems to have an upper hand, except that he doesn't control the skies. Because otherwise, I cannot understand why the army cannot defeat an insurgent group of people. But that's a different question. So my point is, how do you think about they taking a leaf from what happened in Ethiopia in terms of these, the solution of the Africans' own solutions to their own problems? But then you know very well that Ethiopia peace happened because the TPLF, I better be careful so that they don't come and arrest me here. The TPLF, the TPLF was wicked in the position that they had to go for a settlement. In this case, negotiations, and I think this probably ties into what the chair, Ambassador Osei, is saying, because if they all feel that they are strong, why would they go for a negotiation where they know they can win? You see what I'm saying? So I don't know. I'm sorry that I've taken too much time in terms of posing this question, but I think it's a challenge. I thank you.
Prof, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joseph. Very, very good set of questions. And hopefully Ambassador William will protect you if you are arrested in Addis. Yeah, very important questions. The no-fly zone one is very interesting because, as I mentioned there, the RSF, in fact, they're the rebranded form of the Janjaweed. They have the dominance of knowing how to undertake, on-the-ground warfare, but also guerrilla warfare, because they were a paramilitary organization before they were formalized by al-Bashir in 2013. And so they are very effective in, unfortunately, conducting this scorched earth policy. And that's their strength. And that's what they're using at the moment in Khartoum. Whereas the army is not really that competent in that nature of fighting. But the army and the air force, they have the planes and they have the fighter jets, and actually are using them to attack RSF positions, which is not an effective way to fight. In fact, if anyone thinks you can win a war using aerial power alone, it's clearly, I think the generals on this platform will tell you that that's not a winnable war. You can cause a lot of destruction. You will destroy homes, you will destroy lives, you will destroy parts of the city, but you're not going to be able to root out the RSF, in fact, who are prepared to disappear into corners and re-emerge. So now the issue of the no-fly zone would actually only affect Al-Burhan, who is in fact the nominal head of the country. He's the president, he's the incumbent, so to speak, as we stand, which is what Hemeti is trying to, in fact, to overturn, because Hemeti is now hitting the army on the ground. The Air Force, Al-Burhan's Air Force is attacking them from the air. If you impose a no-fly zone, you would actually be tying Al-Burhan's hands behind the back, which for me is not a bad thing, because hopefully it can stop the war. But then they would argue, Sudan would argue, you are taking sides and actually not, not applying the same types of sanctions to Hemeti and his RSF forces. So you could end up being quite partisan. Whereas zones in the past it was a NATO no-fly zone, for example, in Serbia in '99, in Libya as well, 2011. Which it had a very precise objective of containing one unit, one armed unit that was trying to fight. So that can create an interesting dynamic, a challenging dynamic, but also it could turn into being biased and could feed one side against the other, which actually could probably end up even prolonging the conflict even further. So I think that is probably why we're seeing that. It does not mean that in negotiations that might not be one of the issues that might actually be put on the table. So I think that's an important point that you're making there, Joseph. On the IGAD, I completely agree with you. All the players in the IGAD region, and they know this themselves, everybody has their hand in everybody else's pocket. The neighboring countries are supporting the armed militia from the other country, and the refugee flows across the whole region: Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, Uganda, Kenya, South Sudan, Djibouti. Everybody's implicated in everybody else's business. And you're probably right that it's probably not the best to have a mediator from the region. And as I mentioned, Kiir being the lead mediator, with that history of what happened between his country, South Sudan, and the North Sudan, or Sudan, probably creates a dynamic, that's very difficult for a mediator, maybe to be able to divorce themselves and play that neutral role. But the AU has this principle of subsidiarity, where it actually defers to the regional economic community in the vicinity of the conflict. So, and you have this experience in ECOWAS. ECOWAS has taken the lead on a number of issues. Most recently, obviously, Gambia was a very interesting case study of how ECOWAS took the lead and played a very important role, with the AU and the UN supporting from the side. And I think that is the model which is being used in this particular instance. But through discussions, and now it's very difficult to dislodge a mediator once he or she has been appointed, the way Kira is taking the lead. So it might be the case that other players might need to come in and play a co-mediation role. So it's not impossible to have a co-mediator that can actually broaden the scope of this and bring actors from outside of the Horn of Africa, the East Africa region. I think that would be an important dimension, but I don't think that, unfortunately, is currently in the thinking, right? It should be, but I don't think it is. And so the fact that you're in Addis, maybe you can speak to some of the right characters and put that idea on the table as well. Now, on the solution going forward, I think I agree with you. The Ethiopia TPLF agreement came after 2 years of a very brutal war as well. And we certainly do not want this war to continue for 2 years. We don't want to be in 2025 discussing the need for a peace agreement in Sudan. That would be, the country would be really devastated by that stage. I don't think we want to wait that long. But I think there is a model, but it means that both sides have to be willing to come to the party. And I don't know who or how we can get to the two generals to take them, to ask them, to encourage them to actually take a step back and see how they can pull back from the brink. Clearly, it's an issue of power and control, and neither of them want to cede the ground to the other. It's very clear this is what's going on. But it's the same with all the other conflicts that we deal with. And it's the role of the peacemakers to be creative, thinking outside the box and finding ways to actually map out a pathway where you can have even a sequential process in terms of the amalgamation of the RSF, or even a co-formation that allows the country to pull back from where it is at the moment. So Joseph, thank you for those very important questions.
Thank you, Prof. We have a question from Michael Amwa. Michael, if you're still online, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, Prof, for giving us a comprehensive context to where we are at the moment. I've got two questions, if I may. We're made to understand that what really caused this conflict is because Hemeti and Burhan disagreed on a 2-year versus a 10-year track for facing the RSF into the regular army. Yeah. But are you able to unpack what exactly that means? What was the 2-year plan from Burhan? What was the 10-year plan from Hemeti? What exactly did Hemeti want for the 10 years, which Burhan disagreed with? Because that's what we hear, but no one really knows the exact detail of that. So it would be very good if you can explain that to us. And also, one thing that's quite glaring, as we discussed, is that both sides believe that they can win, and the ceasefire is not holding, even for the humanitarian process. There's been talk about perhaps a potential, maybe if Africa can impose an intervention force on the ground in between to actually ensure a stalemate. I mean, I don't know whether the forces may come from South Africa, Rwanda, or Uganda. An African intervention force to be placed in the midst of the conflict to actually impose a stalemate so that the two forces can now realize we can't do anything against each other until we agree on a way forward. I don't know how possible that is, but if you can perhaps maybe address that potential suggestion as well. Thank you.
Michael, that's a very interesting recommendation. Prof, over to you.
Very, very interesting recommendation, a good one. And I hope Ambassador William is taking notes. Thank you, Michael. That's a really, really good questions. Yeah, on the disagreement between Al Burhan and Hemeti, this is in the context in which Al Burhan has in fact been nominally the leader, the country's head, since October 21 when the coup d'etat took place. But the background to all of this is that there was a transition happening towards a civilian government, in fact. So both of the generals had to stand down, and that there would have been democratic control of the armed forces, or democratic oversight of the armed forces, because I know our generals don't like democratic control or civilian control of the armed forces. So this is the main issue, that this in fact was a transition towards civilian government. And in fact, 2023 was the year it was supposed to happen. And I think both generals recognized that they didn't want to go down that road, you know? Both generals are military men. And unfortunately, Hemeti has a background in a very brutal background in Darfur. Al Burhan obviously is also no angel and has been involved in also as commander in the military, in the armed forces that fought a number of wars around Sudan, right? So both are military men in the true sense of the word. And neither of them wanted to cede power to the other. First of all, both of them took the power play away from the civilians, and then they shared it for a time. And then when it came to actually moving forward, and when you are moving towards a civilian form of government or a unified form of government, the idea is that you should have one army, not two armies or three armies. because then you create multiple centers of power. And so the discussion really was how the RSF, which was created by al-Bashir, almost as a ramp force to protect him and some of those close to him. The question of the RSF becomes key. But Hemeti had built such a force, and I mentioned the fact that they were generating their own resources through gold, mercenarism, and so on and so forth, that he personally did not want to cede that power, and also the resources, the private accumulation that he's generating. So it's not as simple as simply saying for the good of the country, because that's not his mindset, I would think. He would want to maintain power. He would want to control also the continued revenue allocation that he's generating. That is why he, I think, wanted this 10-year track to give him enough time to build his nest egg and so on and so forth. And there's an element of personal gain there, so which has to be remembered that some of these they're not necessarily working in the interests of the people of Sudan or the wider Sudan. They are working in the interest of themselves and their cronies, which we've seen so many times before across our African continent. So I think that is a fundamental issue. Al-Burhan wanted a quick amalgamation. 2 years RSF would cease to exist. Hemeti saw that no, this is actually, this is the hand that feeds. So he's going to want to keep it on as long as possible and continue to also wield a certain degree of power. Remember, he was the deputy also in the Sovereignty Council, and therefore had a degree of power and one of the most powerful men in the country. And I think that is really where the issue is. But ultimately, there would have to be some kind of, we're talking about security sector reform, there will have to be some kind of amalgamation so we don't have a repeat of what is going on. And that will be the challenge for the mediators, driving the process forward. On the African Intervention Force, I think is an excellent idea, by the way. I shudder to think which countries will be wanting to send their troops there, but this is the nature of the beast. To the east, South Africa, Malawi, Tanzania. We've had AUP support operations in a number of countries, Central African Republic. We have them in Somalia at the moment, transitioning. Comoros, the AU managed to also send a police enforcement mission. And historically, I mentioned the African mission in Sudan, 2005. Also troops in Burundi, AU sent in 2003. So we have precedent. We have a president of the AU convening and bringing contributing countries together, put in place an intervention. And I think if we get to a point where the mediators are able to craft a pathway forward, I think this will be one of the elements in the agreement that in order to ensure that the fighting does not escalate again, some kind of an interventionary force from a neutral actor like the AU can be sent through to actually keep the peace essentially, and maybe even oversee the demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration process. So I think this is an excellent idea that should be kept on the table, because at the moment both generals will not want to trust the other to put the weapons down. And unless we have something in the middle that can actually hold that space, I don't think this will be resolved anytime soon, which is why, as I said, I hope Ambassador William is taking those notes to Commissioner Bankole and the mission mechanism. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Prof. We have a question from Anthony Akwe. Anthony, you have the floor. Can you unmute him, please? Anthony Akwe, can you hear us? Earlier, there was a request from Dr. Anselm that I noticed is no longer online. Can you unmute, please, Anthony Akwe, because we can't hear you.
Hello.
Yes, hello. You have the floor.
Yes. Good evening. Yes, I'm a former student of Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center. And once again, let me thank you for such a very deep understanding of this conflict. for my question is that on a graph of hurting stalemates, we're taught to believe that before negotiation, as one of the strategy in resolving conflict can be implemented, there must be some kind of level of hurting stalemate. So with a degree of 0 to 100, or with a percentage of 0 to 100, at which level do you think this conflict has got into its hurting stalemate, and that can result in using what we call negotiation approach? Thank you.
I see Prof is having a less smile. After this, after Prof's, okay, maybe Prof, let's take Dr. Anselm's question, then you can take the two together.
Sure.
Dr. Anselm, you have the floor.
Oh, Prof, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thanks for having me. Quite an interesting presentation. I got to connect somehow late due to load shedding challenges. Prof, I have two questions basically. From what we have now on ground, it is certain that the humanitarian crisis is already there. With that in place, why is stability in Sudan critical to the region at this point in time, and what are the stakes for other politically unsteady countries or unstable states, such as, despite the agreement that was signed in Ethiopia, I still know for sure that Ethiopia is still trying to nurse its wounds and it's still quite very unstable. Chad is also very unstable at this point in time, and likewise South Sudan. So my question therefore is, why is the Sudan conflict at this point in time very critical for the region? And then secondly, do you think that there is a clear way out of this conflict? Is there a clear way out? Yes, those are my two worries.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Anselm. Very interesting. And let me start with Anthony's question. I think it's a very interesting question. Great to see the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center is really educating their people on hurting stalemates, which is William Zartman, a theorist on mediation and peacemaking. Now, it's a very interesting phrase, but in the real world, it can end up leaving people suffering for a very long period of time. Hurting stalemate is good in theory.
Yeah.
In practice, right now, we've had 6,000 people killed, 900,000 displaced, going upwards, 200,000 crossing borders, which means they'll have to leave their home. The people are hurting. There is no doubt about that. There's no doubt that the people are hurting. And the people that are not hurting are the ones who can issue command from behind the scenes, from maybe even air-conditioned rooms and, from faraway bankers. So I would not want personally to utilize this theoretical framework to apply it to the Sudan case. And I would say as Africans, we have to, as I said, all hands on deck. This is turning into a regional conflict that we all, as Africans, we all have to be at least sensitized to, be aware of, and do what we can in our own small way to assist in de-escalating the crisis. I'm not even going to go into your spectrum of 0 to 100. It would not make any sense. I would say that people are dying, people are suffering. It's time to act. There's no time like the present. In some of these situations, it is in fact through the process of engagement that you come up with breakthroughs. Because if you don't sit down with the two generals, you won't know what is feasible for them to actually accept, and how we can sequence, their role in in the future Sudan? And how do we map out a trajectory towards a reconfiguration of the state and a civilian, led government that actually is elected by the people, ultimately. So that is where I would approach your question, Anthony. I think definitely use them for your master's thesis and your PhDs, but in the real world, let's try to be more practical and say where people are suffering on the African continent, we have a responsibility to act, and we should, as I said before, all hands on deck. Yeah. So let me leave it at that. To Dr. Hanslem's question, very important questions. Sudan is very critical for the region. It is almost, it's one of the largest countries on the African continent. And in terms of, just the access to the different parts of the borders, 7 countries surrounding it, which means each one of them could potentially be, having to endure refugee flows. We already know that refugees are flowing into Chad. Chad already has its own challenges. If you link the challenges in Chad to the G5 Sahel crisis and the violent extremism that is actually already affecting not only the Sahel and the Maghreb, but is in fact threatening the coastal countries in West Africa, including Ghana, you can see that, there are some significant repercussions going forward if this crisis is not nipped in the bud sooner rather than later. And Sudan sits in that, in that corridor of the Red Sea, which is exceptionally important for trade routes and ships moving up and down, which is why I think you see the international players actually trying to dominate, trying to engage, because the port of Sudan is an important, point of access, entry, stopping, and so on and so forth. United Arab Emirates spending all this money, 6 billion, to actually further upgrade the port. Countries as far as Libya have sent militia to support the RSF. RSF also fought in Yemen and Sudan. In Yemen for the Saudis. So you can imagine that it even is now crossing even beyond. So this is it's a very, very pivotal country, not to mention the long history of the country, the crisis in South Sudan and Darfur, not fully resolved, very much simmering conflicts, conflicts that also need to be addressed. So you can imagine that if we don't address the situation in Sudan, the spillover effect can also, engulf the whole region. And on top of that, there's the Nile River contestation between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, which is unresolved. And the different players there could be looking for different ways to position themselves to either make it difficult for Sudan to function or to help Sudan. And we don't want that to also, become a factor going forward. So I would say it's very, very critical for us to, as Africans, to actually engage. Even just raising our own awareness is sufficient to, to help, alleviate or help others who might not have an understanding of what's going on, to get a better sense of what's going on and why it's important for us as Africans to take the lead also on this particular conflict, as we did in other conflicts, the Ethiopian agreement with the leadership of the African Union, and there are ways for us to do this. I don't think we should feel as though we don't have agency or we don't have, the intellectual capability to actually address some of these issues going forward. Yeah, let me stop there, Ambassador. Thank you.
Just 2 quick things. William, are you still online? Ambassador Kanyirge.
Yeah, he's muted. He's there. I can see him.
Can you unmute him?
Yeah, I'm still online.
William, I'll be asking you to say, as a member of the council, to express our gratitude to Prof. after Cabral has taken the floor. So I'm giving you a few minutes notice. I'm sure I'm the only one you can tolerate this from.
No problem. It will be a pleasure to
Good.
do so. Thank you.
Just give Mr. Cabral 2 minutes to make some announcements about work the council is doing going forward in the next 2-3 months.
I think just 30 seconds. I'm sure Ambassador William will do the needful by expressing our gratitude. But let me also, on a personal note, say a word of thanks to Prof. because I've been dealing with him and it's been nice dealing with him. And we had a chat earlier on, and we intend to collaborate with him.
Good.
As a way of promoting more discourse on the African situation. But what I've been asked to do, and you can see on the screen, is that since our establishment in 2019, we've been organizing a series of lectures, which we describe as the Distinguished Guest Lectures series. Some of our speakers have been Baroness Amos, Prof. Inka, and
Dr. Chambers.
Dr. Ibn Chambers, and I think Ambassador Wuli has been one of the distinguished speakers. We have, in the last few months, been working on the quite to put together about a 20-chapter book, which we have titled Contemporary Issues in Foreign Policy, Diplomacy, and International Affairs. This will be launched sometime in June or early July. And we will be appreciative if our issuer audience joins in the launch. I'm sure that our colleague and friend Ataminsa in Addis will be on that platform. So take note of this book, which is a very elaborate, as it were, platform for serious analysis and discussion of all the issues we have confronted in the last 2-3 years, issues that go to the past and to the future. So we would share the information about the launch date and other written information with our issuer audience. So thanks, and take note. The book is shown on the screen. I hope you enjoy it when it gets adored. Mr. President, I'm finished.
Thank you, Ambassador Cabral. William, you have the floor to do the honors on behalf of the Council on Foreign Relations Ghana to Professor Tim MURITHI for a brilliant presentation. Willie, you have the floor.
Thank you, President of CFR. Let me start this way. When Ambassador Cabral reached out to me to suggest some names, I guess he was also reaching out to others for this honor to be done, the council. Prof was a ready recommendation, but at no point in time, despite our constant communication, did I mention to him that this was what was happening, because I was 120% certain that he was going to accept if he was approached. And I'm so excited that he did. Prof. Tim is a Pan-Africanist to the core, who believes in not just knowledge, but ensuring that we fill the gaps between knowledge, policy making, policy execution, and ensuring sustainable impact. So on behalf of the council, Prof and brother, thank you so much. I should also mention that the Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security, with the support of the African Union Peace and Security Council and the chairperson of the African Union, initiated and got approval for the African Network for Peace, think tanks, a network of think tanks for peace to be launched a week before the summit, the last summit held in Addis Ababa, with a view to ensuring that entities like Council on Foreign Relations and other think tanks have a structured engagement with the African Union to help us anchor our work on knowledge approaches and the nexus approach between peace, security, and development. And it was an honor to have Professor Tim delivering the keynote address, and the Network for Peace was launched by the Deputy Chairperson of the African Union on behalf of the chairperson. So, and I'm aware that Council on Foreign Relations is also a member of the network, and who, like has been mentioned already as a recommendation by Prof. Tim, the African Union will be looking forward to initiatives like that of the Council on Foreign Relations and others to help the Union not only have a knowledge approach, but also to bring non-state actors into the integration, unity, and peace-building process. The gap is too wide, and no effort can be made by the government entities alone for it to succeed. And so on that note, once more, thank you, Prof. Thank you for coming home to your family across the continent and to reflect on this key issue of Sudan, coming as it does after the success story of Ethiopia. We pray that the Ethiopian peace process miracle, which was birthed in Pretoria, in South Africa, will also rub off Sudan, so that sooner than later we shall see peace and Sudan will reoccupy her rightful place as one of the pivotal countries in Africa. Africa needs to pay attention to its pivotal countries. Any pivotal country that is destabilized is going to make our work even more difficult. Pivotal countries like South Africa and Southern Africa, Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Eastern Africa, among others, North Africa, Egypt, Algeria, West Africa, and Nigeria. When you talk about having intervention, when these countries are destabilized, intervention becomes even very complicated. So thank you so much, team. And on behalf of Council on Foreign Relations, to our guests, thank you also for coming to listen and contribute when you were able to. But more importantly, action is key. Thank you and have a good night. Thank you, President.
Really, thank you very much. Prof, your final word.
No, thank you very much, Ambassador. Really appreciate this opportunity. As I said, all hands on deck. Let's hold hands as Africans in solidarity. This is our continent, and let us really do what we can to assist our fellow brothers and sisters who are suffering, and really look forward to establishing partnerships and working with you going forward to address some of these challenging issues on our continent. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. We're grateful that you could join today's lecture, and we'll be having another one pretty soon. Thank you once again. Have a great afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you may be. Thanks and good night.
Goodbye, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. Please ensure to, please, would you mind sharing the recording, please?
You see on our website.
All right. Thanks.
Manuel.